There was actually a time in the Astral Empire, far before the Astral Wolf. Actually, I don't know if this was actually before the Astral Wolf. Yes, it was. This was way before the Astral Wolf, and this was when like some of the other leaders were known to be very valiant and forward thinking, and before I came into the picture, being the Astral Wolf, we had a situation much like this back in World War II. And thank you for Yarn Hub for providing the video. And, during World War II, there was a ferry that took on the Japanese fleet. And it was pretty impressive. They did a pretty decent amount of damage before being sunk, but they were very, very effective. Similar situation happened with the Astral Empire. There are These are the kind of shenanigans that the civilian ships of the Astral Empire would do. If somehow the enemy ever broke through our multiple lines of defenses and many redundant backup systems, the civilian population would arm every single vehicle they have and throw whatever they could at the enemy. The Astral Empire civilians are said and taught that it's better to fight than to surrender. And if they even have to throw their own planet at the enemy, they're willing to do so. There have actually been cases where, before the planetary shields were installed on the planets, the enemy would find ways to get into the atmosphere of the planets to try to terrorize citizens. How sad and how bad of a mistake that was for the enemy. Even though the weapons are not as powerful as the main military weapons of the Astral Tech, the Unity Tech can still do the job well. You will see giant ferries and transport ships bristling with weaponry, firing everything they can at the enemy in an attempt to protect their homeworld. Even taxis and personal vehicles activate their low-level weapons and pummel enemies with their unrelenting fire. The mothership was the last target. The main objective of the astralic population was to hold the line and cut down enemy forces until the mothership was without protection. And remember, this is an invasion fleet, not a planetary-sized fleet. And unfortunately, you're attacking a planet full of very pissed-off people. This is like 10 billion inhabitants all ready to fight. And this was also before the Astral Empire had military-oriented planets. So, considering that this happened, it was scary for the civilians, but they weren't willing to back down. And we're not really sure what enemy this was. We are assumed that this was another one of the Dark Empire's shenanigans, but this one was different. So we assume it was one of their allies. After a long and fierce battle of about a week, surprisingly, the mothership had finally expended all of its resources, taking down a decent chunk of the civilian craft, but losing all of its own, and suffering much worse. Despite multiple civilian craft being shot down, the protection systems allowed most of the crew of these ships to leave in relatively good shape, with the special gel ejection systems. Unless the civilian ship was completely obliterated with one shot, it would be able to eject its pilot, and they would be able to be launched back toward, the support ships that were able to get civilians out of there. One of the amazing things about the civilians of the Astral Empire, especially in this time and era, or back in the day called the Augsfield, is that a lot of them were known for having excellent leadership qualities. And there were people who had, retrieval ships and rescue vehicles that would be prepared to snag stranded pilots and civilian craft after they had been disabled. And this was called rapid, rescue response, or the 3 Rs. And it was amazing because that saved so many lives from being wasted. As the enemy warship tried to escape into space, massive fleets of tug craft and heavy pushing craft, to stuff like push asteroids and even small moons, and anything with a giant engine, slammed itself into the side of the ship, preventing it from getting into space. And, They also were able the mining craft were able to dig into the engines of the enemy ship, preventing them from jumping into hyperspace or hyperlight speed. And the reinforced hulls of the tugboats continued to pump the enemy as others flew kamikaze missions filled with fuel tanks and other such explosive materials into the engines of the massive city-sized ship. This is a huge ship, like freaking Tokyo-sized ship. Like this ship was massive, carried millions and millions of soldiers and many more craft and all such sorts of things. You know, the civilians were going to do everything they could to make sure these people could not escape. After a grueling 2-day battle, the tugboats and heavy assault craft managed to finally overpower the enemy's engines and bring the ship back into the atmosphere, slowly cooking it. Remember, back in this day, before we had shields, we did have interference atmospheric emitters, and this would pretty much turn our atmosphere into this horribly acidic and abrasive layer of just destruction, much like the Van Allen belt. And any enemy that was caught inside this, not allowed, would actually start to get their ship just pummeled with billions of tiny nanoscopic particles hitting their ship and pretty much eating into it, much like an acid. A terrifying reality of, the atmosphere of the Astral Empire, or Augsville back in the day. The orbital defenses started to kick online because the enemy was close enough, and as civilians managed to get into the military bases and fire the weapons inside them. So most of the military was actually away fighting, and there was some military, some crew back in the bases, but they needed help, we call it piloting those weapons and controlling them. So the civilians who had post-military experience or who were already training to fight managed to get themselves into the bases and help fire. So most of the military was already off the planet, like I said, so there wasn't too much to protect the planet itself. So the civilians had to do whatever they had to get their homeland safe again. So over 3 million enemy soldiers were massacred as the ship slowly cooked in the atmosphere before breaking in half, as a reinforced hull, cutter hulls finally broke the structural integrity of the mothership. Remember, these ships were made to crack asteroids, so they would ram their ship into it with the reinforced hull, and that would destabilize the structural integrity of a lot of celestial bodies that they would ram their ship into. So these ones, played a major role in, pretty much shattering the enemy ship and, cutting it in half. As the ship broke in two, the tugboats knew that they had to make sure that this thing slammed into the planet to make sure everybody on board was dead. By this time, the civilians were not, planning on being nice. At this time, the civilians were like, screw you guys, we're going to make sure every single one of you is dead. And, civilians were pretty much like, we're not taking, we're not taking survivors. And yeah, they pretty much even threw escape pods of the enemy ship into the atmosphere so they could burn up on re-entry. Like, this was one of the few times that one of the many times that the astrologic people were like, screw you guys, we're not going to be nice anymore. So after saying their goodbyes, multiple tugboats activated their hyperpulse drives of their crafts and pointed their ships straight down. After about 4 or 5 minutes, the massive city-sized ship crashed into the ground at over 7,000 miles an hour. And, this created a shockwave that shook the entire continent. But they managed to pilot it into a mountain, so that way the mountain and the terrain could kind of absorb a lot of that impact. This still caused, a massive shockwave, and we had to get atmospheric scrubbers up there to help clean the atmosphere before we got thrown into a nuclear winter. But yeah, these tugboat captains, and individuals who were piloting them were like, screw it, we're gonna make sure this thing slams into the ground, and that's what they did. They overdrove, they put their overdrives on and threw themselves and the mothership into the planet, and even though the enemy ship was completely atomized, they were actually able to get some scans of the weaponry and the ability using their mining craft. They were able to figure out how the enemy ship was made and some of the internal working systems. And the civilians, being the resourceful people they were, managed to make their own ships based off what the enemy did and make them even better. And because of the quick thinking and of the sacrifice of the civilians to protect their homeworld, they fought a force that would have normally taken over a planet. And not only that, they managed to fight on the same level as the Astral Empire's elite forces back in the day. Month-long ceremonies came after this spectacular victory, and a couple thousand civilians were posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor and Honor, called the Wolf's Heart. Survivors and those who participated in the battle were awarded massive rewards and given high-level access to future defense mechanisms of the planet, and some of them are even still allowed today, thousands of years later. After this event, the Astral Empire, when, Adensville came into the picture, knew just how important a civilian defense committee was, and therefore, as two militaries now, one is the main astralic military, and the other one is the civil defense military. But they work in tandem to ensure the safety of the Astral Empire and its inhabitants. And ever since, no enemy has managed to wage war on a planet of the Astral Empire, because of the amazing teamwork of both militaries. And it is mandatory that all civilian and military vehicles are armed and ready to fight in case the worst shall ever happen again. Blessings of the Astral Seven. So, yeah, even though the enemy had an invasion fleet, the civilians, just because of their mass quantity and swarm tactics, were able to overpower the enemy. And because a lot of them had reinforced hulls for mining and, construction, they were actually able to take a lot of the hits that the enemy fired at them. And because there were so many of them, the enemy started to run out of, ammunition before they could return to the mothership to reload. And then the reinforced hulls of the mining ships would cut through their ships, depressurizing like large portions of it, killing most of the crew. I mean, the astralic people back in that day were like angry piranhas. It's like, you're inside our pond, we shall eat you. And it was scary because like the tugboats would like ram enemy ships into the main mothership. Like the mothership was pretty much gutted, and that's one of the things that made the enemy try to escape, because like, oh crap, we just lost almost all our stuff, we need to retreat. And my people were like, nope, you're not leaving, and in fact we're going to make sure you don't wake up again. And that is when when a few tugboat captains rammed their ships into it and pretty much activated their hyperlight engines. Remember, hyperlight allows them an incredible amount of thrust, way more than what is needed for sublight activities. And because of this, that allowed them to push the enemy ship to quite a high speed into the planet. So even though a huge crater was put into the planet, because the ship wasn't solid like a normal asteroid would be, this allowed the planet to take the brunt of the attack, of the impact, fairly well. And this was inside of a ring of mountains, so the mountains provided natural protection against the shock wave as the enemy ship slammed into it. And and in fact, the civilian people, what they did is that they actually rebuilt really quick. Remember, astrals are told, well, the astral populace are told to be very, what do you call it, are told to be extremely, what's that term? Resilient and forward-thinking. They're taught to be, figure out, situations and handle things right. So even though they had, had suffered a battle and, lost a couple thousand, you know, they did a really good job at, supporting each other. Even older military craft was used to like spearhead the assault, so that way, the enemy's fire could be, s- uh, you know, uh, concentrated on those, while the civilian fleet would be able to attack from the other areas. And in fact, there's actually been certain battles while the Astral Wolf, came into power, where the civilians actually had to help out. There was a time where Adinstvo, was concerned because he didn't have enough ships to, of his own ships, to defend two parts of his empire. So the civilians were like, "Fine, we'll protect you. You take care of that one enemy. We'll take care of the other." So Adinstvo took himself and his ships over to the more powerful enemy group, while the civilians went over to the other enemy group. And because this was after the civilians had armed themselves and prepared for attacks, the enemy was just devastated because even though Adinsfo has like the most powerful ships in the universe, his people have billions of ships. So you have like 130 planets worth of civilians all enraged. It's like, how dare you attack our friendly planet? And then suddenly the enemy is being attacked by billions of ships, just, eradicating them left and right. Like, the civilians numbered so many that the enemy didn't know what to do. And there's a special ship that the civilians have called the Stasis Bubble Ship. And when the enemy is about to launch a weapon of mass destruction, the civilians can actually launch their own ship into that weapon. And what it will do is that it will fire a stasis bubble, temporarily freezing the systems of the super weapon, allowing the civilian ship to grab it and take it to a safe place, either for assimilation or for destruction. And so the enemy tried launching some mass destruction, weapons, and the civilians like, no, you don't, and they turned the weapons against them because of their advanced hacking capabilities. So it was really, really cool because you would just see this angry swarm of billions of civilian ships just, eradicate the enemy attack force. I mean, remember, this was like 3 or 4 invasion fleets all in one. And the civilians, and the now evolved civilian defense force were like, screw you guys. We're gonna defend our planet or die trying. And the planets now have much longer range quantum weaponry. So the planets themselves were able to fire highly maneuverable, like planet-sized projectiles into the enemy ships, either disabling them or exploding them. And because the civilians work so well with each other, even in situations of great turmoil, the planets were able to work in tandem to defend themselves and the Astral Empire. And it was great. And, this allowed the Empire's allies time to come in and help. And, the Aetherians and the Estovakians were the first ones to arrive, and they helped mop up the enemy. And no prisoners were taken. The Astral Empire's kind of given up on, trying to be nice to people who attack them. So unless they get away, they're most likely going to be obliterated. And yeah, I mean, the Astral Empire is still quite benevolent, but like Arsenal X in my other story, they kind of are getting sick of being nice, and sometimes they just have to put their foot down and say, "Hey, you sent these people to take over our home. They're gonna die," and they are executed. Usually in like a mass quantity. Like usually what they do is that they clump them all together, fire a nuke, and call it good. They don't want to, elongate any suffering. So it's there, fire Astronova Bomba, and set. Or you just throw them into the sun. But they make sure it's quick, because, they don't want to cause undue suffering. But sometimes the Astral Empire is just like, fine, whatever, we're just going to get rid of them. Now, there are times where the Astral Empire sends, POWs back, but, you know, like it is. The Astral Empire is far from perfect, and we do have some dark areas to our history, but we are trying to improve upon that and better ourselves so that the rest of the universe can be bettered as well. But yeah, so this is just kind of a few fun examples of how the Astral Empire civilians are able to defend themselves and protect themselves. And, in fact, it's said that sometimes civilians, by how effective they are sometimes on par with most other militaries of other empires. And in fact, other militaries are just like, yeesh, it's a good thing that we are friends with them. And like I said, guys, the civilians are actually going to be helping in this final attack against the Dark Empire a few thousand years from now. And when that happens, the Dark Empire is going to feel the entire wrath of the universe against them, and they will be eradicated once and for all. Anyway, guys, this has been Sabin Dimitrov, aka Adins for the Astral Wolf. Been a pleasure to have you guys here for this other fun little history lesson and little fun little thing of what the Astral Empire has done in this past. And hopefully you guys enjoy this fun little short story. You guys stay awesome, and always remember, God bless.